Can people today atone for the horrors of history? Georgetown University thinks so, as it announces plans to make amends for selling slaves almost 200 years ago. Also on today's program, the UN is accused of failing to protect a group of humanitarians from a sexual attack in South Sudan. We speak to an aid worker who was raped in a separate attack there and ask her what more can be done to protect them. And in Picture This, from falconry to bone hunting, forget about Rio, we bring you the action from the World Nomad Games. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. In 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 slaves, and the money raised helped to secure the future of what is now one of the US's leading academic institutions. Almost 200 years later, the university has promised to make amends for its links to slavery by offering, among other things, preferential admissions to the descendants of those slaves. It's one of the most decisive acts of its kind in a country where the roots of slavery can still be traced in all parts of society. Our newsmaker today is Georgetown University, as we ask if it's going far enough to make up for its past.
We must acknowledge that Georgetown University participated in the institution of slavery.
An apology for the sins of its forefathers. After more than 170 years, Georgetown University has said sorry for its links to slavery.
This original evil that shaped the early years of the Republic was present here, and we have been able to hide from this truth, bury this truth, ignore and deny this truth.
The university says it is now seeking forgiveness, in particular from the descendants of 272 slaves it sold in 1838 to help pay off its debts. As part of its penance, it says it will create an institute to study the history of slavery at the school, rename 2 buildings that had honoured university presidents who oversaw the sale of the slaves, and give the descendants the same admission preference as the children of faculty, staff and alumni. Georgetown is going further than other US universities in confronting its past links to slavery. But for some, it's not far enough. For some of the descendants of the sold slaves, Georgetown's attempt to atone falls short.
It seems to me that the best title for it would be Georgetown Reconciles with Itself, because it really is all about Georgetown and has very little to do with us descendants.
They argue the sale of their ancestors ensured the university's survival, and giving financial help or scholarships to their descendants is the least the university could do. Georgetown's apology follows protests in universities across the United States earlier this year. Black students protesting against systemic racial inequality at universities, built on the back of black slaves. Is this apology from Georgetown a step in the right direction for healing the wrongs of history? Or is this a gesture that is merely symbolic? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Nottingham in the UK is Christopher Phelps, an Associate Professor of American History at the University of Nottingham. Mr. Phelps, thanks a lot for joining us. So Georgetown University made more than $3 billion from the sale in today's money. Is that maybe the price they should have paid if this was going to be more than just a symbolic gesture?
Well, what you're pointing to is that slavery, which we now think of as oppression, as wrong, as morally incomprehensible, was an economic system first and foremost. It was a form of labor exploitation, labor extraction. It was unpaid labor, and it was the direct ownership of human beings. So this sale, which strikes us as wrong, is one aspect of what Georgetown did. It also used slave labor in building some of the buildings on its campuses. And whether this is enough, I'm not sure it's my personal place to judge this. They've had a process on the campus which the descendants of the slaves themselves felt could have been more inclusive of them, because the commission that was chartered to undertake this determination of what the institution could do to make up for this moral wrong was absent any member of the families of those who were directly descendant from the slaves that are sold. So one thing they could have done is in their process actually given power and voice and representation to those families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could have been more inclusive, I guess. So to what extent do you believe that this might have an impact on contemporary racial tensions in the United States? So you have the Trump phenomenon, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, and then on campuses themselves, campuses are quite divided. We saw situations in Mizzou, at Yale, issues of race, safe spaces, and so on. Might this be a starting point to a better conversation?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a process unfolding in the United States. Around 2014 is when the Black Lives Matter movement took off around police brutality and killings of unarmed black men in communities. And then over the next several years, that spilled into youth who were coming onto campuses, deciding to take up such issues on their campuses. And in so doing, they're pressing these causes at Yale, at Princeton, at Harvard. They're asking for buildings to be renamed, for racist symbols to be removed, at Oxford University in the UK as well, where Cecil Rhodes' statue was a controversial matter. And so all over the world, really, and this includes South Africa, students are asking for these symbols of the white supremacist past and these institutional wrongdoings to be rectified in some way, for there to be a historical process of reparations. And yes, I think it's significant that Georgetown is taking this step. It may be criticized for not being enough. For instance, they're giving preferential treatment in admissions to the descendants of these slaves, but they haven't offered to provide funds for those students to then study. So, you know, we're offering a $70,000 a year education preference for people who might not have the ability to pay for such an education. They could have made a financial commitment to the education.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's, you know, it's not a scholarship, it's not a bursary. It's just putting you sort of, I guess, at the front of the line if you qualify, right? It's just like being a teacher's kid or something like that. I wonder, is this going to reopen the question of public reparations? Because this is very different. You have an individual private institution almost, you know, sitting in confession and going, I want to cleanse myself. It's almost like maybe a corrupt businessman giving charity, right? But then there's a separate issue of public reparations on a federal level or national level, the government coming in and saying, hey, to fix the injustices of the past, we need to take this money or whatever, or opportunities, and give it to people who didn't have this opportunity in the past. Is that going to be on the table now?
Oh, I think it most definitely should be on the table, and then it's an incredibly complex issue. The entirety of American society really was built on this unpaid labor, and it's one of the main reasons why there's such deep-seated racial inequality in the United States. African Americans have almost no net worth. That is, their savings measured against their debt comes out at about zero, compared to white households having something in the range of $70,000 to $100,000 net worth. And that's a direct result of centuries of slavery, followed by centuries of Jim Crow racial segregation, all of which was meant to keep African Americans in a secondary status and make it easier to pay them a lot less than their labor was worth. And how the whole society does that, but it can't just happen on an institutional level. Georgetown itself can't rectify that. It gets at the very basis of American history, which was the paradox of a democratic republic that was simultaneously a slaveholders' republic. So there's a national conversation unfolding about race. Unfortunately, much of it is retrograde in the form of Donald Trump's contributions. But the students at Georgetown and elsewhere who have compelled these changes should be saluted, and let's hope they go farther.
Yeah, but as you say, it's almost impossible to implement if you do it on a national level in terms of public reparations. The question is, who gets to decide, and how far does it go? Do you give the land back to the Native Americans?
There's a whole can of worms. And there are many people who have written on this. Actually, before slavery was even abolished, there were African Americans raising the idea of reparations. It's a very old idea. And what's interesting about our moment is that certain institutions are taking measure of themselves and trying to square their history morally. If the country could do that, and you're right, there's absolutely no one plan that might satisfy everyone and exactly how to go about it. There are probably multiple good ways, but the country could do considerably more than it has at present.
How would you respond to someone who says, okay, we cannot be responsible for the crimes of our ancestors? We're a democracy now. Everybody starts off on an equal footing. All things considered, let's do our best to build a future. Let's look forward and let's not look back.
Right. Well, that's an understandable reaction. And I think that the point is not to hold any white person in a kind of criminal sense responsible for slavery. What's being asked is not some sort of punitive measure. What's being asked is some kind of redemptive justice for historical crimes that have created present-day inequities. And I think that there's a reasonable kind of moral conversation that can go on about this, and it might be a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
But I think there's given slavery's magnitude, just as we look at something like the Holocaust, I think, and Germany has tried in various ways to come to reconciliation about that and truth, and look at South Africa's process about apartheid and the truth and reconciliation process. And there can be a truth and reconciliation process in America about race.
Yeah. Final question for you, just from a purely historical perspective. I had 2 young girls in the US public school system for a while, and history, from my perspective, was taught to them very much in this sort of linear way, where one day Abraham Lincoln gave a speech at Gettysburg, and he was killed, and many years later, you had Rosa Parks went to the front of a bus, MLK gave a speech, JFK was killed, Barack Obama was elected as president, and there's this sort of sweeping mega events in a linear way, all sort of progressing along. And just the mere fact that there were these Jesuits who owned and sold slaves in Georgetown in 1838 is a fascinating historical story there. Is this an opportunity for Americans to dig a bit deeper in their own history?
One would hope. I mean, what you're expressing there is the classic frustration of the professional historian like me, actually, which is that if you read American history as it's now written by historians, it's much more about social life and popular history. The slaves were freeing themselves. That's why Abraham Lincoln had to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. As the Union lines were advancing south, slaves were coming off the plantations in effectively a general strike against the plantation labor they'd been subjected to, and running into the Union lines, which then had to face the consequence. Do we return these slaves to their owners because we respect private property law, or do we call them contraband of war and decide that they're part of the enemy's rebellion and we're not going to return them? And they ended up doing the latter, which then compelled the Emancipation Proclamation. So the reason slaves were freed was not because Abraham Lincoln had a good idea, but because the slaves themselves acted on it. And yes, time and again, we have these moments where people start attending to history and they realize that it's beneath the surface of the heroes and the superficial events that we use to kind of shorthand history, and that's understandable. And some people really are heroic and they play a kind of breakthrough moment role. But the history is complex, and the country is, it's not just a celebratory history that should make Americans feel easy and happy about their history. It's a complex one in which there's a lot to owe up to.
Christopher Phelps, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Still to come on the Newsmakers, we speak to one woman trying to break the stigma of sexual violence within the humanitarian community, as a horrific attack on aid workers in South Sudan exposes how severe the risks can be. And in Picture This, a celebration of sports you've probably never heard of, as Kyrgyzstan hosts the second World Nomad Games. In mid-July, a group of South Sudanese soldiers broke into what was supposed to be a secure compound in Juba and raped several humanitarian workers. It lasted several hours, and UN peacekeepers stationed nearby are accused of ignoring calls for help. The incident has helped to highlight the particular danger of sexual violence faced by people, and especially women, working within the humanitarian community. Randolph Nogel has more.
Peace in South Sudan exists only on paper. Fighting between government and rebel forces broke out in July, less than a year after a peace deal was signed. Rebel leader Riek Machar, who had joined a unity government, fled the country. During 4 days of fighting, 36,000 civilians were displaced, more than 300 people killed, and an unknown number of women and children raped. Both sides have been accused of using rape as a weapon throughout South Sudan's civil war.
Please, I beg the international community to see what is happening in our country, okay? Because this one is too much for us.
On the last day of fighting in July, South Sudanese troops carried out one of the worst attacks against foreign aid workers in the 3-year conflict. They broke through the gates of a hotel compound and gang raped several foreign aid workers. UN peacekeepers, based less than 2 kilometers away, didn't respond. The US Embassy didn't either.
Here in South Sudan, looting, attacks, threats and harassment are a daily occurrence. The heinous attack on Terrain Hotel on July the 11th was an egregious assault on humanitarians and needs to be repeatedly and loudly condemned, and the perpetrators brought to justice.
The UN has launched an investigation into whether its peacekeepers ignored calls for help. South Sudan is one of the most dangerous places in the world for aid workers. At least 59, most of them Sudanese, have been killed since the conflict in South Sudan began in December of 2013. A war that has left the world's youngest country divided and its most vulnerable people exposed to sexual brutality, along with those trying to help them. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Geneva is Megan Nobert, the founder and director of Report the Abuse. Her organization has just published a report on NGO structures to prevent sexual attacks against their staff. Megan, thank you very much for joining us. How important is it to you for you to speak out and recount the experience that you went through?
I think it becomes increasingly vital given the latest news about another attack on humanitarian workers. My own experience was slightly different in that I was attacked by a colleague, but regardless, any attack against aid workers is important and must be spoken about.
The UN has launched an inquiry into allegations about that incident in South Sudan, that peacekeepers did not prevent abuse and sexual violence against civilians and foreigners in Juba. Do you believe that peacekeepers in general have been failing to do their job?
In South Sudan, absolutely. There have been a number of incidences reported publicly, as well as those known more accurately in South Sudan, where they have stood by and watched individuals, primarily civilians, be attacked, be gang raped, be dragged away.
Do you think?
I genuinely believe the peacekeepers in South Sudan are failing people.
Right. So you have the UN sending 4,000 more peacekeepers. So they seem to think that if they increase the numbers, then things might get better. But it's about something else, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not about the numbers, it's about how they're being used and the willingness to act when atrocities are being witnessed.
If an aid worker wrote to you and said, I want to go to South Sudan and let's say it's a woman who says, I want to go to South Sudan and I want to help, would you advise me to go? And what advice would you give me?
So I've actually been getting this question quite a bit over the last few months, but increasingly so in the last few weeks. And it's a hard question to answer because on the one hand, the people of South Sudan are incredibly vulnerable, particularly the women and children, and we must, as humanitarian workers, be there to do what we can for the local population. That is our purpose. That's what we do. That's our job. It's a profession, and that is our job. On the other hand, it is becoming increasingly dangerous as a female in particular to be operating in South Sudan. And my response is ask your organization what they have in place should something go wrong. And not just an act of sexual violence, although that is an important question to ask. But what are their evacuation plans more generally? What is their medical evacuation plans given a fairly uneven access to medical care throughout the country? What will you do for me? What can you do for me? And if you can't do something, what measures do you have in place?
You've been talking to organizations. Have they been listening?
Questions and being honest.
Yeah, have organizations been listening to you?
Actually, absolutely. I've actually been I was quite surprised by how overwhelmingly positive organizations have been as we've been speaking to them over the last year. I think it's a question of timing. And there is a movement, a momentum in the industry right now to talk about issues that are difficult. Sexual violence against and within the humanitarian development community being one of those issues. Now, the response has been positive. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that it's also an issue that organizations can't really say they're not behind. Any organization that says sexual violence against my employees is in no way important to me or I don't care if it happens, that's going to be setting up quite a difficult situation. So they have to say that they care. Whether this will translate into action, I think, is the more important question, and we are seeing some positive signs. When we were doing the research for the report we released on the 19th of August, I think it was 9% of organizations did in fact note that they had zero policies, procedures, response strategies, nothing in place to address sexual violence against either their employees or against the local population. And that's, first of all, it makes an organization incredibly vulnerable to admit that. But every organization that did admit that said, we are actively working on addressing it. Now that we've identified this gap, we do want to fill it. So there is absolutely, I think there is a movement right now to start addressing some of these issues. And again, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive.
And looking at what might be a more difficult conundrum, besides addressing organizations, when we look at the governments involved, so with the South Sudanese government, these were South Sudanese soldiers. They said, they've already executed a couple of them. These were rogue soldiers. They didn't follow, orders or chain of command. How difficult is it then, if you have an incident like the one at that hotel where those aid workers were raped, how difficult is it to then engage with a government whose soldiers were responsible for this when they're saying nothing to do with us, just a bunch of rotten apples?
It's incredibly difficult. That's where states who have a stake in peace processes like those going on in South Sudan should be stepping up and pushing for there to be real accountability. There was a number of incidents that have happened in South Sudan over the last few years, including in the last insurrection. There was attacks on WFP's food banks. Incredible amount of food was stolen. There has been massive attacks against local population and attacks against civilians, against humanitarian aid workers. It's time for governments to step in and start pushing for there to be change. That's not necessarily for the organizations themselves, because I think that makes it difficult for a humanitarian or development organization to approach a government on that kind of a matter because it can jeopardize being able to provide services to the local population. So that's where governments need to be stepping in.
Okay, Megan, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Megan Nobert, joining us there. Who needs a ball when two teams can battle it out over a goat carcass? Yep. In today's Picture This, we take a look at the 5-day sporting spectacle that's been taking place in Kyrgyzstan, the World Nomad Games. Today's newsmaker was Georgetown University, which has announced plans to make amends for the way it benefited from slavery almost 200 years ago. It decided to offer preferential admission to the descendants of slaves linked to the university, which is going further than any other academic institution trying to make up for its past. But while most people agree that Georgetown should be applauded for focusing on the issue, others argue that it's mainly symbolic. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.